Thank you very much. This session is actually a very interesting session. We have a politician, an advisor, and an academic. So for sure we're going to go over time into the lunch period here, because we're all paid to talk a lot. In essence, my job as an advisor is to help emerging and developing countries implement and design e-government policies, looking at e-content, looking at the existing infrastructure that exists in the countries, and then try to help in the knowledge management aspect of it. In this presentation, I'm going to take a snapshot view of what the UN e-government survey looked at in the Asian Pacific region in terms of the capacity, in terms of the e-content, and in terms of knowledge management available around. So in the agenda, we'll look at the old e-government survey, what's new in the 212 survey, some of the results that we looked at, and focus a little bit on the M-government aspect, and finally some conclusion remarks. Essentially what e-government survey is, it's a comparative of 192 countries. And there we look at the human capital, we look at the infrastructure, and we look at the online access. And those are essentially three different and distinctive indexes. And combined, together we call it the e-government development index. And essentially it's a toolkit. It's an advisory tool that decision makers can use to find out where the resources should be spent, what are the strengths, what are the challenges that currently exist, and how governments can actually react to that. And the fourth pillar is something called e-participation. It's part of the online services. And what we've noticed in the last several surveys is a lot of people talk about e-participation, but very few countries can actually implement it. And one reason behind that is it takes a lot to change the culture of people to be able to take trust in their government, to provide some kind of feedback, and expect something in return. Essentially, there are four objectives that e-government that the UN is espousing. One is that e-government should lead to efficient government managed information for the citizens. It should be better service delivery to citizens. We're hoping that it improves access and outreach of information. And lastly, but most importantly, it empowers people to get involved in order to make a better decisions for their own lives. Essentially, we have four stages. And for the most part, the vast majority of countries in the Asia Pacific are between stages 2 and 3, the enhanced stage and the transactional stage. And very few countries are in the network stage. The network stage is where we have full citizen engagement, e-participation between government, citizens, government and business, and so forth. While the transactional stage is the full types of e-services, whether they are integrated, whether they are simple e-services. And the enhanced stage is where the communication starts between government and citizens in terms of the ability to get information online, download forms, and that type of stuff. So the vast majority of countries are between the enhanced stage and the transaction stage. The 212 survey is looking at, in addition to what the 210 survey added, 6 new themes. One is the take-up and the training. As we mentioned before, a lot of e-government services are put online but are rarely used. And I think one reason behind that is that when services are actually implemented, the views of the citizens were not taken into account. So the government assumed that these are the types of services that were required and therefore put online without actually getting the real feedback from the citizens. And what we looked at also is that services that had a high take-up were services that had some feedback from the citizens and then modified those services to meet those needs. We talked about the use of mobile connectivity, and my colleague, Dr. Kerby, mentioned that a lot of people have mobiles, and that's true. But end government is slightly different than that. We also have to have the infrastructure in place in order to have complex services that can be delivered by phone. So essentially we're looking at iPhones and Blackberries and Androids that can physically take real in-depth and complex services and put on the mobile devices. So when we look at the survey, We see how many countries have mobiles per 100 users, and quite a few are up there. So the trend can be to move from E to M services, and that will ensure that a greater number of the population have access to e-services. Vulnerable groups. This is probably one of the most difficult things to do, because everyone who has access to information services, to computers, are not in this category. So how are governments trying to develop policies, good practices that enable the youth, the elderly, in some cases gender, in most cases the vulnerable, to have access, to have outreach, to have different ways and different services that meets their needs? And that's one issue that the vast majority of countries have not properly tackled yet. But we're trying to see in the 212 survey how countries are putting their best foot forward in order to bring in this vulnerable group into a more cohesive manner. We're also looking at multi-channel aspect as well. Everyone talks about computers and mobile, but we're also talking about having kiosks available where people can physically go to an ATM type machine and get information, pay for services online. They can also go face-to-face to the front office. So it has to be a multi-channel effect. How are governments in general finding different avenues to connect with the people? Is it through Facebook? Is it through Twitter? Is it just physically coming in? What are the incentives that the governments are using in order to give the citizens different aspects, different ways of communicating, of using the services for them? This morning, Vincenzo talked about the whole of government, or the one-stop shop. Essentially, if a user is using the internet, they normally go to Google, they search, and then they get landed on the website. And that's how most research is done on the internet. But what we're looking for in the whole of government is that once you've captured the citizen on your website, that there should be enough information, enough content to keep that citizen there. And that's what we mean by whole of government. If I want information about the government in Korea, I can go to one portal and get the bulk information. That portal can guide me to various sub-portals to be able to get services, knowledge, information, and any type of documentation that I would like to have as well. And that's something that a number of the less developed countries have a very tough time in grasping. We have lots of small, non-integrated portals that do not communicate among other systems in the country. So we're looking at simply having one place to go, and that place will then open up various doors to get to where you want to go, and hopefully within a certain number of clicks. So we're looking at how our portals are properly being designed in order to meet those challenges. And the theme for the 212 survey will be the environment or sustainable development. So how are countries giving information to their citizens on clean water, on pollution, on biodiversity, etc. Here are the top 15 internet countries by sheer numbers. As you can see, China is number 1, followed by the US, Japan, and so forth. But the key here is not the actual internet user. Look at the last column for the broadband aspect of it. This is where we want to make sure that if you're going to put up services online, you have to have a very strong broadband backbone in order to ensure that people have effective services. And developing countries have a very low broadband. I think this is one of the critical issues that need to be looked at in the Asian Pacific region, is how do we improve broadband to have access to ensure that the last mile is covered, that it goes straight from the beginning point to the house. In terms of the 210 survey, the breakdown in terms of the Asian Pacific region is in front of you here. And as we can see, that Eastern Asia was the highest and Southern Asia was the lowest, with the world average about 4.04406. So we have a number of regions slightly above, a number of regions slightly below. And that's because of the sheer size of the region itself. You have countries that have done tremendous amount of work, like Korea, like Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Bahrain. And then you have countries that have a long way to go. And as a result of that, some of the averages get skewed a bit, because it also looks at the actual financial aspects of the country as well. Countries that have money tend to do a lot better than those who don't have money. And these are the top 20 countries in our e-government development index. And this index encompasses, again, the human capital index, the infrastructure index, and the online services. As you can see, we have, of the top 20, 12 belong in Europe, 4 in the US, in Asia, 2 Oceania, and 2 in the Americas. And this is the actual list of the top 10 Asian countries within the e-government development index. And you can see that, again, there's a lot of countries out there that have broken the top 10 that one might have thought of years ago. For example, Kazakhstan is a good example of that. You know, Kazakhstan has done a tremendous amount of development in terms of their own portal, in terms of their own access, and they have actually jumped quite a bit. Mongolia didn't make the top 10, but it's another country that's also had a massive leap. They went from 100 to the 50s in less than 4 years. So there's a growth possibility that exists in this region. And as we look at the 212 survey, we see that this growth will continue, that the Asian countries will continue to move forward because of the sheer development, the sheer infrastructure that exists vis-a-vis the numbers of the population. So as development comes to India, as it continues in China and Indonesia and all the very big populative countries, the services will come hand in hand as well. And as a result of that, the Asian countries will continue to move up the UN survey. Now, when we look at just plain online services, we see that Asia has surpassed Europe. And as a result of that, we're looking at this point, we're simply looking at online services, nothing else, in terms of transactional online services, information, knowledge. And these are the top 15 countries within the Asian community. And you have countries like Uzbekistan cracking the top 15. The Philippines are there. Malaysia is in the top 10. Mongolia is 9. So you have this massive progress that's taken place in the region. Because e-government, for whatever reason, is becoming a major tool that governments are using in order to increase the services available. As my colleague mentioned, maybe it's not getting all the votes, but in terms of development, in terms of success, if you look at that list, those are the countries that are succeeding. Those are the countries that are investing in e-services, in infrastructure, in human capital. And those are the countries that will continue to move forward as we look at the 212 survey as well. And when we look at the e-participation, this is where we look at, does the country have discussion forums? Are there Twitter pages available? Are there Facebook available? We see that Asia still has 6 countries in the top 10. And these are the top 10 countries in Asia. And look at number 10, Kyrgyzstan. Who would have thought 2 years ago that Kyrgyzstan would be in the top 10? Right? Or Kazakhstan would be in the top 10. And these are the countries that we look at, the emerging countries that are taking e-government to a next level, that are investing their time, investing their resources, and educating their people to use these kind of services. Especially when you have a vast country and small population. You have to use this kind of e-government service in order to get ahead these days. We talked about the use of mobile apps, and I want to bring 4 cases to your attention here. The first one is actually in Korea itself. We actually have a development center in place as part of the government in order to become a smart city. So in this case, the Busan Metropolitan City is actually investing lots of money to ensure that it becomes a quote-unquote smart city, right? Where anywhere you go to, you can pick up your iPhone and get services online. And that's the kind of progress, of innovative practices that we're trying to showcase in the future. Right? Australia has a mobile apps on the elections for 2011. So you can have real-time updates, find out where your district is if I want to vote. So if I don't know where my district is, I can just simply pick up my iPhone, download the apps, and find out where to go. Right? And I can also have real-time results on the actual results itself. These are things that are being done. All these mobile apps that are available for people to use. It's not just the private sector doing this. The government is also doing this as well. And that's a key element to the future. In the case of Saudi Arabia, the Ministry of Education has a mobile app you can download on iTunes, and essentially allows all students to follow their own entitlement that they're able to get from the government. I can find out when my funds will be transferred to my account. I can find out when I can get my ticket to go back home for home leave. I can find out when the next deadline for any kind of documentation is needed simply by going online and downloading these apps free of charge. Okay? And Singapore has also been a leader in the mobile application, where they have over 300 electronic services online. And all these things together are what the Asian community is doing. They're using mobile application, they're using e-government services, they're improving their infrastructure, they're improving their human capital. They're improving all these things for one reason only, and that is to ensure that the people have access to services, have access to information, have access to knowledge. And as a result of all these things, the citizens themselves become empowered. And therefore, they have a more active lifestyle in terms of e-government. They have a more active interplay. They can dialogue directly with the government. They can have their opinions heard by the government. And more importantly, their opinions can also impact policies. You can see changes on how government thinks, how government reacts. We've seen issues these days where social networking tools have actually transformed government and actually have toppled governments. When the government allows its citizens to interact with them, when the government entices, encourages this kind of interaction, there is a clear message that the government is giving to its people that, yes, I want to hear you, and I will work with you. And if you get that message as a citizen, you feel comfortable, your trust is increased, and as a result of that, you are better apt to use the kind of services available for you. And those are the words I want to leave you with today, is that, in essence, we're living in a region where there's a lot of potential growth out there. For the most part, the European community has leveled off. You can't get more than 100%, whereas the Asian community has lots of room to grow. And that growth is coming through using e-government. 5 points left. As I mentioned, the upward trend continues. But there's still a big gap between the e-government rich countries and the e-government poor countries. And I'm hoping that there is some kind of partnership that can be developed with this gap that exists currently right now. Can countries like Singapore, Bahrain, Japan, Korea assist other countries? I know the Koreans are doing that, I know the Singaporeans are doing that, and we want to maintain that process as well. Even at the UN, we are sending a number of countries on study tours to Korea, to the UK, in order to get a better aspect of what countries are doing which are rated high on our survey. Greater emphasis on end government, because that is the future. It's easier for a cab driver to have a phone than a computer. It's easier than a housewife to have a phone than a computer, or a student's phone or a computer. So the more services you can develop that are mobile, the easier it is for students to use them, for citizens to use them, for mothers to use them. Broadband is still a major problem in most countries. That investment has to be made in order to continue the growth. And the last thing I want to leave you with is that the social networking tools available today are where all our children are playing. And the children, to me, children means 25 and under, by the way. So when these children are playing on these social networking tools, government have to be there with them in order to get their reaction, in order to get the kind of service that they're looking for. And these social networking tools become important. It's not just having a Facebook page and just dumping data. It's also scouring around the internet through a Facebook page, through Twitter page, to find out what citizens are thinking about your services. Are they positive or are they negative? And if they're negative, why are they negative? And what can you do to change that? these networking tools are here to stay, and we need to better use them as government, as public sector officials. And if we don't use that, we're going to pass us by. And we've seen an example of what already happened in certain countries. So these are 5 conclusions that I have based on the results we have from the 210 survey. The 212 survey will be out in January 2012. We're in the process of actually doing the assessment right now. And I'd like to thank you for your time again.